At 1:55 p.m. on April 14, 1912, a single piece of paper carried by hand to the bridge of RMS Titanic saved more than 1,500 lives and condemned 8,000 others to die 6 years later in the North Atlantic. The message was a direct ice warning from the SS Californian, relayed by junior operator Jack Phillips rather than buried beneath a backlog of paid passenger cables. Captain Edward J. Smith read the paper twice, then ordered speed reduced from 22 knots to 12, additional lookouts posted in the crow's nest and on the forecastle, and the course shifted slightly to the south. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. For decades, maritime historians have studied the cascading failures that placed Titanic on a collision course with the iceberg that sank her. The communication breakdown between Marconi operators and ship's officers was, in reality, only one link in a long chain. But it was the link most easily broken. Had Phillips simply walked the Californian's warning up to the bridge, as procedure arguably required, Smith would almost certainly have acted. The hours that followed would have been tense, uncomfortable, expensive in terms of arrival schedule. They would not have been catastrophic. And what no one aboard could have known, as Titanic crept through the ice field at reduced speed, was that their safe passage would rewrite the next 30 years of maritime history, not for the better. Titanic docked at Pier 59 on the morning of April 18, 1912, roughly 18 hours behind her advertised schedule. The delay was reported in the New York papers as a minor inconvenience, one of several the great liners had suffered during an unusually heavy ice season. Reporters who gathered on the pier found Captain Smith composed, Thomas Andrews pleased with the performance of his ship, and J. Bruce Ismay offering carefully measured praise for Smith's prudence. In private, Ismay was less charitable. White Star Line had promised a 6-day Atlantic crossing, and 18 hours was 18 hours of coal burned, contracts strained, and competitive advantage surrendered to Cunard. In the Pier 59 offices later that afternoon, witnesses recalled Ismay remarking that next season's schedules would not permit such indulgences. The remark was noted and filed away. Smith, approaching retirement, would make his final Atlantic crossing that autumn. The ice warning that altered his course would appear in his ship's log as an unremarkable entry, one of many. No one outside White Star's inner office would give it a second thought. The British Board of Trade, under President Sidney Buxton, had been reviewing the 1894 lifeboat regulations for several years before 1912. Those regulations, drafted when a 10,000-ton vessel had been considered immense, required lifeboats based on gross tonnage rather than passenger count. Titanic, at more than 46,000 tons, carried lifeboats for barely half her complement and was in full compliance with the law. Without a disaster to force the issue, the review continued at the measured pace of pre-war Whitehall. A draft proposal circulated in 1913 recommended lifeboat capacity for all souls aboard any vessel carrying passengers. The shipping lines objected on grounds of cost, boat deck space, and the weight implications for stability. The proposal was returned for further study. The international conference that, in another timeline, would have convened in London in 1913 to draft the first convention for the safety of life at sea was never scheduled. There was no catalyst. There was no public outcry. There were, most importantly, no names of drowned women and children to be read aloud in Parliament. Through the summers of 1912, 1913, and into 1914, Titanic and her elder sister Olympic continued profitable express service between Southampton and New York. The third sister, Britannic, was laid down at Harland and Wolff in Belfast and completed in early 1914 to her original plans. The design modifications history remembers the double hull extended to the waterline, the watertight bulkheads raised to B deck. The full complement of lifeboats were never specified. The builders saw no reason to add weight and cost to a proven design. Guglielmo Marconi's company, meanwhile, continued its practice of training wireless operators as commercial employees first and safety officers second. Paid passenger messages retained priority on every set. The convention of a continuous 24-hour wireless watch, which would have required 2 operators on every major liner, remained a proposal in trade journals rather than a requirement in law. The North Atlantic trade was prosperous, celebrated, and entirely unreformed. And then, in the August heat of 1914, came a reckoning that no shipping regulation could prevent. The outbreak of war in August 1914 drew the great liners into service almost immediately. The Admiralty, under First Lord Winston Churchill, requisitioned tonnage under the Peacetime Merchant Shipping Acts then in force. Olympic became a troopship. Britannic, barely out of her sea trials, was converted to a hospital ship. Cunard's Lusitania continued commercial service until May 7, 1915, when she was torpedoed by U-20 off the Old Head of Kinsale with the loss of 1,198 lives. Lusitania's sinking provoked diplomatic outrage and a wave of anti-German feeling on both sides of the Atlantic. It did not, however, provoke a reform of lifeboat regulations. She had carried lifeboats for all aboard. The problem had been the speed of her sinking, not the shortage of boats. The lesson drawn in Whitehall was that submarines were the threat, and submarines were a matter for the Royal Navy, not the Board of Trade. Lifeboat capacity on troopships was increased only where individual captains pressed the matter with their requisitioning officers. Most did not. The war was expected to be short. The consequences of this complacency were still 2 years away. In late October 1917, the former White Star Express liner HMT Caledonia departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, carrying more than 9,200 Canadian and American soldiers bound for the Western Front. She sailed in a loose convoy of 6 vessels escorted by 3 destroyers, a formation dictated by the shortage of escort tonnage rather than by tactical preference. Her holds had been converted to troop accommodation at 3 and 4 tiers of bunks per deck. Her lifeboat capacity, adjusted modestly from her 1912 specifications, covered roughly 1/3 of those aboard. The soldiers packed her decks were young, most of them under 25, drawn from farms in Saskatchewan and mill towns in New England. They had been told the crossing was the safest part of the journey. The U-boat war, they were assured, had been contained by the convoy system introduced that spring. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, a moment planned by a German naval staff officer named Reinhard Scheer, who had directed that autumn's commerce raiding campaign specifically at the Allied troop convoys thickening in the western approaches. Caledonia was struck by 2 torpedoes from U-93 at 3:47 a.m. on the morning of November 2, 1917, roughly 400 miles southeast of Cape Race in a rising gale. The first torpedo detonated against her forward boiler room. The second struck amidships, fracturing her keel. She began to list within 3 minutes and capsized in under 40. The destroyer escorts, hunting a second submarine contact several miles to the east, reached the survivors more than 2 hours later. The water temperature that night was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Men who reached the handful of launched lifeboats survived. Men clinging to wreckage or struggling in lifebelts in the freezing water did not. More than 8,000 soldiers and crew were lost, most from exposure rather than from the explosions themselves. It was the deadliest single incident of the war at sea, and the deadliest loss of Allied soldiers in any 24-hour period of the conflict. The lifeboats aboard Caledonia had been sufficient for roughly 1 man in 3. The choice for most of those aboard had been made years earlier in a Board of Trade office in London. Lord Mersey, who had presided over several wartime shipping inquiries, was appointed Rec Commissioner for the Caledonia investigation in the spring of 1918. His report, delivered the following year, documented in painstaking detail the regulatory lineage that had placed 9,000 men aboard a vessel with lifeboats for 3,000. The 1894 Merchant Shipping Act, the shelved 1913 Lifeboat Review, the wartime requisition rules that had simply inherited peacetime standards, the individual captains who had raised concerns and been overruled. Mersey's findings produced the catalyst that Titanic, in this timeline, had not. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, delayed by a generation, was convened in London in 1920 and signed in 1921. It imposed lifeboats for all aboard every passenger vessel. It required a continuous wireless watch on any ship carrying more than 50 passengers. It established an international ice patrol in the North Atlantic. The reforms that a single ice warning in 1912 had made unnecessary were purchased, instead, at the cost of 8,000 soldiers drowned in the dark off Cape Race. History sometimes spares the ship it had seemed destined to sink. It does not, in the end, spare the reckoning. It only changes whose names are read aloud when the bill comes due.